used to wander around these old derelict docks in his pyjamas, and that was the Albert Dock. And so they decided they either make it into a great big car park or they renovate it, and thankfully for us they renovated it at Albert Dock. And the night as well, there's hotels, but you could also stay on a yellow submarine. Did you see that floating hotel boat, the yellow submarine? So you can stay on board there, and you can stay next door to that on the sinking Titanic in rather bad taste. But they're both floating hotel boats. They're good fun actually. Did you see King Victoria? There you go. And then a very quick look to the left, look down to the left quickly, and that's Liverpool Town Hall. Now the Beatles came back to Liverpool triumphant, and then take a look down this little road. That's the Hard Day's Night Hotel, and look down this road to the right, and that's Matthew Street. Matthew Street is where you'll find a famous club called the Cavern. It's actually on the right hand side of the street. Because you'll see this fantastic building now called St George's Hall. Over to the far left, William Brown Street is where you'll find the main museums and galleries of Liverpool. 65 at the Empire Theatre. It was on the steps of St George's Hall, sadly, that we gathered when we lost John Lennon in 1980, and also again in 2001 with George Harrison. Hopefully it'll be a long time before we have to mourn Ringo and Paul. But look into the left, this is Lime Street Station. Just to give you an example, to travel from London Euston to Liverpool Lime Street, it takes you 2 hours and 7 minutes. And so it's the main line station into Liverpool, and it's a pretty good one. But in front and to the right, you've got the building with the blue window frames and the golden letter W. That's where a young lad got a job as an apprentice electrician. He was a bit rubbish at his job, so the manager called him in. He said, "Listen here, young George Harrison, you're going to have to make a decision. It's the band or the job." And George said, "I'll stick with the band, thank you very much." And he went off on a tour of Scotland with his band, who at this point were known as the Silver Beatles. So in front and right, we're going to see a very rude statue above Lewis's department store. In front of you and right, you can't see him, blinking heck. You need glasses then. So that statue, it was called Liverpool Resurgent. We call him Dickie Lewis. And there's an old folk song about Liverpool that says, "In me Liverpool home, in me Liverpool home, we speak with an accent exceedingly rare, meet under a statue exceedingly bare, and if you want a cathedral, we've got one to spare. In me Liverpool home." That's the statue exceedingly bare, and that would be a meeting point. You know, you meet a bloke in the clubs or something, and you say, "I'll meet you under Dickie Lewis," and then not turn up most of the time. Prove. So along with John just came Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and the Beatles manager Brian Epstein. No drummer, because Beatles history changed that week. On the 16th of August 1962, they fired their regular drummer. That was a guy called Pete Best. On the 18th of August, they brought in Ringo Starr, and John was married on the 23rd of August. So Pete wasn't talking to them, and Ringo wasn't considered close enough to be invited as a wedding guest. So that's why there was no drummer at the wedding of John and Cynthia. So keep looking over to the right, we'll see number 64 Mount Pleasant, and that was the town registry office where the marriage took place. So it's coming up now. The house is number 64. Will you still need me? Will you still feed me when I'm 64? The answer was no chance, because a little Japanese lady came along and kind of ruined all that for them. So that's it, just a very ordinary building to the right, and that was the town registry office. Born on the 9th of October 1940. All of the Beatles were born during the war, and they grew up with rationing and bomb sites everywhere. But look to the left, and this is the Everyman Theatre. The Everyman Theatre was it's where all the smaller plays take place, and in front and to the right you've got a very ornate pub called the Philharmonic Dining Rooms, commonly known as the Phil. So just have a look, it's absolutely beautiful in there. They do a good pub lunch. The Philharmonic, John Lennon was asked by a reporter, "What's the price of fame?" And he said, "I can't have a drink in the Phil anymore." It's a gin palace that was built in 1900. Now to the left you have the Philharmonic Hall. So the Philharmonic pub was built to serve the patrons of the original Philharmonic Hall, and this hall is home to our orchestra. So that's a sculpture called the Case History, and every piece of luggage there belonged to somebody who was special to Liverpool. So if you took the time to research them, you've got the history of our city, and there are a couple of guitar cases belonging to Paul McCartney and one for George Harrison. There's also a parcel that John Lennon sent around the world. Now once again, this statue at the waterfront, although it represents 1965, There's a little bit of a nod to the future for all of them. So in John's hand around his back, he's holding little acorns. John and Yoko sent acorns to world leaders. Good bit of trivia knowledge this. The last Beatles #1 hit was the ballad of John and Yoko. And in that they sing about 50 acorns tied in a sack. It was one of the peace campaigns. They thought if they sent acorns to world leaders, world peace would grow along the oak trees. Didn't quite work, but it was a nice idea. So 14-year-old George, 15-year-old Paul, they would hide their school ties and they'd sneak next door into this building on the corner to meet up with 17-year-old John Lennon. So this shows you that our boys really grew up together. They didn't just go on a Simon Cowell's telly shows and were turned into a band. They knew each other from an early age, and that's one of the things that made them special. Now Paul McCartney came back to his old school years later to find it had closed, and he decided to do something about it, and he opened up his own school here, the Liverpool Institute for Performing Art. So it's now a fame school. We call it Paul McCartney's fame school. The other guys get a bit upset by that, but Paul is the figurehead, and he was here on Monday at the graduation ceremony. First thing he puts in his diary every year is the graduation ceremony for Lippo, and he works all his world tours and things around that, which is wonderful. They've also now purchased the art college on the corner, and so the whole corner here is Paul McCartney's fame school. The cathedral was completed in 1978. And so it really is quite impressive. It's 100 metres high there, and the Gothic arches inside are very, very impressive. So well worth a look, and it's free to enter the cathedral. But they said to him, sorry son, you have a weak voice, you can't read music, you're no use to us, and that was Paul McCartney. So if Paul McCartney was a reject for the choir, imagine how good that choir must have been, eh? And so the architect of the cathedral, his name was Giles Gilbert Scott, and his other claim to fame in British architecture was the red telephone booth. And so I say booth, I'm used to working with Americans all the time, a phone box is what I meant to say. And so one of the most bizarre things you'll see inside a cathedral is a phone box. It really is quite weird to see it. John Lennon and his band, the Quarrymen, they played on the back of a coal wagon in Rosebery Street. John was looking like a bit of a tough guy with his check shirt and his drainpipe jeans and sneakers, and all the women in the audience thought he was wonderful, not so much their boyfriends, and John realised that the boys in the crowd had actually got pretty hostile. So as soon as he'd finished his performance, he jumped off the back of the coal wagon and ran into his mate's house nearby with a big gang waiting to beat him up outside. It wasn't quite as tough as he looked, our John. But as you hear the story unwind, you'll realise he grew up in quite a posh suburban village here in the inner city. He wouldn't have stood a chance. But one little guy who did live here was called Richie Starkey to his mum, Ringo Starr to the rest of the world. So now I'm going to show you where Ringo Starr lived. I want to go up this next one because Ringo lived in two houses. First of all, he lived in Madarin Street, where he was born, and then he lived in Admiral Grove, where he lived from about the age of 3 until he was a Beatle, till he was a famous Beatle. So at the top of this street, you'll see a pub called the Empress. We might get a little tickle from the trees. So you'll see a pub called the Empress at the top of the street, and that was featured on the cover of an album by Ringo called Sentimental Journey. And that's the street where Ringo lived when he became a Beatle. So look directly in front of you, and can you see the house that's painted white and pink? Okay, so that's where Ringo lived from about the age of 4 right up until he was a famous Beatle. And that's the pub on the corner that features on his album cover. And that's one that his mum actually, she worked in the pub. And then if we do the next right, and then we'll go back the way we came, this will show us Ringo's birthplace. So he did come from a very working class part of Liverpool. This area is known as the Dingle. And then it's quite easy to spot which one's Ringo's. If you do take a look to the left, you'll see one where people have lovingly left their mark. It's number 9, but there's no numbers on them. So have a look, see to the left. It's the one covered in Beatle graffiti. See? So that was the birthplace of Ringo. So hopefully we'll do something nice with that in the future. Near future, I'm hoping, because they've been like this for far too long.
Yellow submarine, yellow submarine. We all live in a yellow submarine, yellow submarine, yellow submarine. And our friends are all aboard, and many more of them live next door.
Went up to him and told him that his hat looked stupid, and he said, well, that's a pity because you look lovely, and he took his hat off and threw it in the boating lake. That began the relationship between a lady named Julia Stanley and a man named Freddie Lennon. So if they'd not met on that day in this park, we'd have no John Lennon, no Beatles, and I'd have to get myself a proper job, wouldn't I? So the park, we have all kinds of festivals here. We have food festivals, music festivals. He loved this park. He lived in a 2 up, 2 down with no garden, so he absolutely loved it, a bit like Ringo's house. So when he heard the Palm House was in a bad state, he remembered his happy times with his father there, and he helped pay to restore it all. So thanks to George Harrison, Sefton Park Palm House has been beautifully restored, and we'll see that in between the trees over to the right in just a minute. There you go, can you see the glass palm house? And that was restored with help from George Harrison and other Liverpool people. So it's a lovely, lovely place.
I am who I'm meant to be. I am who I'm meant to be. Over and out again.
You have an ask. You ask.
Well, you ask her
then. A school here called Dovedale. This is the school attended by both John Lennon and George Harrison. John was a couple of years ahead of George, but the two of them went to the same primary school from the age of 5. It's definitely their paths were crossing. Been released in Hamburg in Germany and imported a crate. And so he becomes more and more intrigued and asks the kids what's so special about these Beatles, and they said go and see them for yourself, they're playing the Cavern today. So he went down to the Cavern Club, saw the Beatles on stage, was knocked out by what he saw, offered himself as the manager, and they accepted. So he started to look after the Beatles' careers from the beginning of 1962. Now once he got the Beatles, he then found out that, you know, he liked managing bands. This was the first time he'd actually managed a band. And so he found out about this cloakroom girl at the Cavern Club, and he thought, I'll see if she needs me as a manager. Now this girl's name was Priscilla White, but everybody knew her as Cilla Black, of course. Cilla's father was a Liverpool docker, and he insisted that each one of these management companies came to see him at his Liverpool home. And so Brian Epstein turns up. One by one he rejected them all. Brian Epstein turns up and he says to Cilla, there you go love, that's your manager, we're going to have Brian Epstein as your manager. And Cilla was delighted. She said, oh great Dad, is it because he manages the Beatles? She had nothing to do with that. Is it because he's from Liverpool, Dad? She went, well yeah, that's a possibility. I like he's from Liverpool, that's not the main reason. She said, why Dad, why is Brian Epstein the one you want as my manager? And he said, because 20 years ago I bought a second-hand piano from his dad and it's still going strong. I trust that family. So we're going to see the home of John Lennon now. In the village, it's where Cilla's funeral took place. So from the age of 5, he lived with his auntie and uncle. When he was about 4, his mum had a fling with a soldier and gave birth to an illegitimate child who was adopted at birth. She then fell in love with another man called Bobby Dykins and went to live with him. So John's auntie Mimi, who was far more straight-laced than his mum Julia, she took John away from his mother when he was 5, and he lived in a very nice, this was a lovely part of Liverpool. And so he lived here with his auntie Mimi and Uncle George, but just around the corner from his home was an orphanage. Beaconsfield Road, please John, that one there. Well, where all the cars are going. So just around the corner from his home was this orphanage that became a very special place to him. He might have ended up somewhere himself, like an orphanage, and he didn't live with his mum and dad, so he felt a real affinity with the children at the orphanage. So much so that years later he wrote a song about the orphanage which was called Strawberry Fields.
Strawberry field, nothing is real, nothing to get hung about. Strawberry fields forever.
closed down years ago. The original building was well gone, but the Salvation Army are now fundraising to open up a training centre for young adults with moderate learning difficulties, and they will also, the young adults here will run a visitor centre for Beatle fans. So it's going to be a great little place and hopefully open up round about the year 2018. They haven't started yet, but they're currently fundraising for it, which I think is fantastic. So Strawberry Field has become well known around the world, and really all we've got left are these gates at the moment, and even their replicas, because people were trying to saw bits off from the original gate. So Strawberry Field was just around the corner from John Lennon's house. So what I'm going to show you now is the house that John shared with Auntie Mimi and Uncle George. This is where John Lennon lived. So keep looking to the left, and in just a moment you're going to see a house that very thoughtfully has a big blue plaque on that says John Lennon lived here. And this is the home of John. This is where John lived with Auntie Mimi and Uncle George from the age of 5 until he was 23. So when you think about it, that's almost 18 years, and he died at the age of 40. It's almost half his life. So just after these green railings, if you take a look left, we'll pause outside this the home number 251 Menlove Avenue, the childhood home of John Lennon. This is it here to the left. So John lived there with Auntie Mimi and Uncle George. They had no children of their own, so they treated John as their own. His bedroom was that little window, little bay window above the doorway. That's where he'd sit and he'd play his Elvis Presley songs and dream of being a star. Auntie Mimi came up to him one day when he was probably got a bad school report or something. So she came up to him and she said, listen here, young John, the guitar's all very well, but you'll never make a living out of it. But from playing that guitar, he made quite a nice living. He realised that Auntie Mimi was not getting any peace. Beatle fans would be camped outside the house all the time. So one day, he took her down to pool indoors at Sandbanks, really expensive strip of land, and he said, hey Mimi, what do you think of this house? She said, oh John, it's lovely, lovely bungalow on the side of the river. Oh, you and Cynthia and Julian are going to be very happy here. He said, not us, Mimi, I knew you'd like it, I bought it for you if you want it. She said, you can't buy me a house, John. He said, I can buy you anything I want. Auntie Mimi, you brought me up like your own child and I owe you a great debt. He said, I even got you a moving in present because I knew you'd love it. And he pointed over to the wall where there was a brass plaque engraved with the words, the guitar's all very well, John, but you'll never make a living out of it. Now this home is now a National Trust property, which means that you can get to go inside the homes of Lennon and McCartney, only with the National Trust. She came to visit Mimi. She ran across the road to catch the bus home and tragically was knocked down and killed. John was 17 when this happened, and he says he lost his mother twice. He lost her once when he was 5 and he couldn't understand why he'd been packed off to live with his auntie and uncle, and nobody explained it to him. And then he lost her again at 17 when she was taken from him so cruelly. So we really felt the effect of this. So John named his son Julian after his mother Julia. Julian was 5 when John ran off with Yoko Ono, and 17 in December 1980 when we turned on the news to find out that John Lennon himself had been shot and murdered. And so in honour of John Lennon, I'm going to play you one of his most famous solo songs. She was sick of being moved around, so they moved to a new council estate on the edge of the city, in this area known as Allerton. So she loved it here, she really liked the home. They started to settle down and put down roots, but very tragically Mary McCartney died of breast cancer just 6 months after they moved in, when Paul was 14. So both of the boys lost their mothers at an early age. So Paul kind of lost himself in his music, and it was in the 6th of July 1957, the following year, that he'd become a good musician, because he'd sit and he'd play his guitar in his bedroom. And so he went to the St. Peter's Summer Fete in Woolton Village and he saw John Lennon play, and played a couple of songs for John, and John was so impressed he asked Paul to join his band. Paul McCartney joined John Lennon and his band the Quarrymen in 1958, but sadly Mary McCartney lost this battle with cancer when Paul was just 14 years old. So looking across to the right, you'll see St. Bernadette's Church. She was a staunch Catholic, Mary McCartney, and that was where her funeral took place. It's a very sad tour today, isn't it? It's all about deaths and things, but some beautiful songs came out of all of this. Forthlin Road, So look on the right hand side of the street. See the one where the roof is redder than the others? Come next to that and see the one that's got kind of buttery coloured windows?
Yeah.
There's people stood outside it actually. That's the home of Paul McCartney. That's one of the many houses he lived in, and that's the other National Trust property. So I do hope that you will get a chance to come back and visit the homes with the National Trust. Write songs together. They'd more often than not do it in Paul's house because Paul's dad was quite tolerant of them, whereas John's Auntie Mimi was very strict and wasn't. Let me just give you a little recap on how the Beatles became the Beatles, because we started off Paul joining John's band, the Quarrymen. So John formed a band with his mates from school, the Quarrymen, and Paul went to see John at the St. Peter's Summerfete and joined. Now we've just followed an 86 bus along Mather Avenue then. The 86 bus is the route that Paul and George would take to school together every day, and because they shared this bus route and because they always had guitars with them, they became good friends, so they started becoming mates. And Paul told John about George. He said, hey John, I know this guy who's a great lead guitarist. And John says, I've seen him and not having him in my band. He looks about 11. He said, he's not 11, he's 14. John said, I don't care, I'm a 17-year-old art college student, not having a little kid like that in the band. So he didn't ask him to join because he was too young. But George hero worshipped John and he followed him everywhere. So everywhere he went, he knew that George would be there in the audience. So if one of the Quarrymen didn't turn up, all he had to do was say, hey, do you fancy playing today, George? And George would jump on stage and just became one of the bands. So George Harrison in 1958 then joined. So we've got John, Paul and George by 1958. Now one by one, the rest of the regular Quarrymen, they went and got proper jobs when they left school, so we're left with this core of John, Paul and George. So they changed the name then, they changed it to the first letters of their names, the J page 3. But then John goes to art college and meets a guy called Stuart Sutcliffe. Stuart joined the band as a bass player simply because John Moores of the Littlewoods organisation bought a painting from him, and that gave him enough money to buy a bass guitar. So the J page 3 is not a good enough name now. So they all have a little sit down, they get together and they say, what shall we call ourselves then? And they're all huge fans of Buddy Holly and the Crickets. Why don't we be another insect? And so they choose Beatles. They mess around with other names like Long John and the Silver Beatles, then they drop the silver, they drop the Long John, and they change the spelling of Beatles to Beatles with an A, and that's the name the world knows them by now. So John, Paul, George and Stuart get this chance to go and play in Hamburg in Germany, where there's a big demand for Liverpool bands, but they had to have a drummer. So they brought in a guy called Pete Best. So John, Paul, George, Stuart and Pete went to Hamburg in August 1960. Only John, Paul, George and Pete came back because Stuart fell in love with a German lady and stayed in Hamburg. Sadly died very young. There's a great film called Backbeat about the life of Stuart Sutcliffe. So John, Paul, George and Pete played the bars of Liverpool for another year or so before Pete was fired the week John Lennon got married. Pete's out, Ringo's in, and this is when they became the Fab Four. So it took from 1957 until 1962 for the Beatles to become the Fab Four as we know them. So when Ringo joined the band, they'd managed to get themselves a record deal then, and this is when they released their first single. The song was called Love Me Do and it got to number 17 in the British charts. The second single was Please Please Me and it got to number 2 in the charts that they still use today. The third song was From Me to You, and that was the first #1 hit for the Beatles. So I hope you're all taking this in for your trivia questions. I hope you are. February 1964, the Beatles appeared on this really popular American show called The Ed Sullivan Show. The crime rate of the United States fell to an all-time low because everyone stayed in to watch the Beatles on the telly. Isn't that incredible? And so when they appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, they went #1, 2, 3, 4 and 5 in the American charts. Over in Australia, they held the top 7 places. They really did conquer the world and show them what was great about Britain. They became part of the British invasion. So the song that they kind of conquered the rest of the world with was this one. mountains across the far side. So that's your River Mersey in full flow. And the tide is relatively high here today. It's the difference between high and low tide is 30 feet or 10 metres. And so you don't see so many ships this end of the river because they can run aground on sandbanks. But we've got 53 cruisers in the river this year, which is unheard of really. Now the stone of Liverpool, it's sandstone. It's the same colour as the wall behind us at the Penny Lane sign, and of course the big Anglican cathedral, that was all taken from local stone. And when you look at it, the stone is actually the colour of liver. There's different theories as to how we got our name. A lot of them involve old Viking words or the fact that there was loads of seaweed called lava on the waterfront. So why wasn't it called Lava Pool? You know, they say they all came from this. My favourite theory is that when the tide went out in the River Mersey, the mud was this reddy brown colour, and it was the colour of liver, and so they called us the Liverpool. So that's my favourite, and it's the one that makes most sense to me. There are other theories that other guides will tell you, but I'm going to stick by that one. We're named after offal. And so we're heading back towards the city centre now. Directly in front of us are the liver birds, and that's where you're going to pick up your famous ferry across the Mersey.
My future needed clarity, so I could see how you react, how you react to me. So much differently, I am different. Every time that I look back, I see my fortune. When you react to me, we are reacting so much differently. Doubted all that I could do, knowing what I need to do. All I can say, the word is thank you. I think it's what you need to push away from the shore, amongst the waves. Exactly where I wanna be. I am where I wanna be. Remember the start, remember the start. When my future needed clarity. Yes, I needed clarity, so I could see how you'd react, how you'd react to me. So much differently.
Hey guys, so I don't know if you've caught on to what's happened today, but yesterday morning we got on a taxi and we picked up my niece, who's Jess, and we took a coach all the way over to Chester, and then we walked around Chester for a bit. We saw those shows that I showed you, and then after that we took the same coach back into Manchester, and we stayed there overnight at the Britannia Hotel. I think it was called the Britannia Airport Hotel or something like that. We woke up this morning and then we've caught the coach down here to Liverpool. So I don't know if you saw that, but we kind of took a little tour around Liverpool and heard a lot about the Beatles, which was amazing. So yeah, we're doing that, and now we're on a ferry, pretty much on another tour around Liverpool again. So yeah, we're just on the ferry now. I think we're gonna go around, come back to the port, and then like take a look around Liverpool. So yeah.
Exactly where I wanna be. I am where I wanna be. Remember the start, remember the start. When my future needed clarity. Yes, I needed clarity, so I could see how you'd react, how you'd react to me. So much differently, 'cause I am different to you. Every time that I look back, I see my fortune. When you react to me, we are reacting.
Hey, I'm the Coda Killers.
Added it. It's got ninja brain, so I added it. You should have like a pear shape, like good or something, and you Like peaceful bits of spinach.
I think you should try it. I mean, Jess worked really hard to bake it. She worked really, really hard. No, there's nothing behind it. Oh look, it's ready to go. It's ready to go.
Have you had something nice off Jess? Have we had a present?
Is it safe, Jess, to eat?
She wouldn't give you a bad one.
Take a bite, I'm not going to collapse.
She wouldn't give you a bad one.
The kangaroo comes later, doesn't it?
That's it.
Another one starts.
You're a natural.
I'm waiting. That's delicious. Could I have a bite? Could Granddad have a bite?
Yeah. Yeah, I think you should share it. Yeah, I think you should share it. Yeah. Oliver, there's nothing wrong with a cake, is there? Look, Uncle Paul ate it. I mean, yeah, eat it. Yeah, it's chocolate.
Does Oliver want to buy?
No, I don't think Oliver would like it. It's kind of funny.
I don't think David's very keen.
Maybe Grandad's got the
Yeah.
to confess to what you put in it then, Jess. Hot sauce. Hot sauce.
Oh, that was.
You should have put the
Why are you actually?
Yucky.
You should have seen what he had yesterday. He went down the Broadway.
mushrooms.
You got this Ferry hot because he likes the hot stuff.
Okay.
And mushrooms.
It was like this.
Is it in hot?
This is right.
Yeah, bro. You can have it back.
There you are.
He said, do you want to...
Look at this.
Mushroom.
Oh,
Mushroom.
I've been boxed up for the girls.
You want a bite, Randy?
Have some, have some, have some, have some. I think you should have a lolly just to wash it down.
Don't let Ace know.
You'd be a bit suspicious if a Robbo was called at your door to win.
Shall I give it to Gigi then instead?
Yeah.
And then when you turn around, oh, I know him, I know him.
Radish and then
No, thank you.
the orange
Give
one
it
is
to,
this.
give it to
really
Ryan.
sour
Then.
tomato
Ryan will
thing.
like it.
No, give it to
Ryan.
Grandma Paul. Grandpa Paul. Grandma Paul. Oh God.
You're going to give it to Paul?
Grandad can have an orange one.
Oh,
Grandma
Gigi's
Paul.
going to get it. Thank you.
That's what
Did
Jess,
you know
that's
that
what
Ryan
Jess
is
called
an
me
uncle?
yesterday. She said, Grandad Paul.
Oh, Ryan
Give that to
is an
Paul.
uncle.
That's what you say. Yeah.
Strange.
Do we really want this in the girls' gang? I don't.
No.
No, the boy.
Has it got to be a boy who gets
Yeah,
it?
you have to
don't
share
want
with your
nothing in the
friends in the boys'
Hey,
gang.
Oliver.
No.
Not boys will get because you had the
I
hot
think
sauce.
Grandad should have it.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Oliver.
Mummy.
I think Ryan's trying to tell me something.
Mommy.
Yeah, I
Yucky.
think Ryan might want it.
Am I... No. Why not?
Because girls can't do this boy thing.
Oh.
Have one because he's a boy.
That's just a normal sweet.
Okay.
I got from, we went off to the shop, didn't we, Mum?
That doesn't taste like the sweet.
No, Nanny Cook's not going.
It's a good sweet.
No.
That's a bit
Is
gummery.
Is Nanny Cook going to be in the girls' gang then?
Yeah.
Just just bite into it.
It's soft.
Yeah.
Think it's yucky one day.
Yucky.
Well then eat the orange one too. Maybe it'll balance it out.
Yeah. One against the other.
I think they look alright.
It's yucky one day.
Yeah.
He's eating it though.
Wash it down with this one.
Do you remember
Just
when
wash it down.
it reminds me of him.
He was fair, wasn't he? Yeah.
It's a sour lolly.
One
You remember Fred? He was ever so strict. He used to Spit it out, Wanda. He was better off away from her. 2, 1. That was the first one, because that is not in the boys' gang.
Not in the boys' gang. Not allowed. Not allowed. If you move up a little bit further up there,
Yeah, then people
Grandad
will fit
could get by you then.
Most likely to be rich.
Bucky Dean.
1, 2, 3.
So 2 votes, 3 votes for Jess.
1 vote for Jasmine. Most likely to be poor. Debbie, it's me.
Me? It's Debbie. She spent all that money on makeup and lipstick and all that.
Who is mostly likely to have been the heartbreaker?
Uncle Dave. Granddad.
Good evening, Miss Courtney. Just giving you a
Yes.
call a bit of touch.
Who is most likely to live in a big city?
A big what?
Big city.
Who's most likely to split his pants?
What is it?
Most likely to split their pants.
Hey, I win.
Who is most likely to watch romantic movies?
Mr. Brown.
Who is most likely to be the best at math?
Yeah.
Everyone votes for
I
Debbie.
think you're going to have a
Are you
surprise.
quite good at maths?
Who is most likely to be a drama queen?
I'm not even a girl.
Who is most likely to have the
You
most
got a pen,
piercings?
Jess.
No, Debbie. Debbie's already got 7.
I've already got 8.
8.
7. Who is most likely to die of something stupid?
Were you not expecting us? No, the authorities don't notify the individual teachers of the results. And the jury, Miss Courtney, has
And then
kept me
lastly,
informed.
who is most likely to embarrass themselves in front of a secret crush or known crush?
Delighted to be making you
No, wait, no, this.
Ah, what a nice...
Most likely to get into a fight.
This is gonna be realistic. Debbie's gonna pick me, I know.
It looks remarkably like yours, Mr. Brown.
Most likely to say silly things. Oh,
Oliver's a baby.
Oliver.
I think Oliver heard.
What? Most likely to cook a good meal.
Not Debbie.
Wait,
what is that?
she's helping someone give birth.
Crying.
Most likely to lose their temper. I don't know for you.
He's not gonna be
Is that what I think you'd say?
He's just got to give the letter you write to Miss Courtney to his girlfriend.
I gotta go.
Most likely to profess their feelings about something.
Oh, yeah.
Ninja Granny.
She'll take food back.
Well, I'm not doing it.
Most likely to say something they will eventually regret.
Ninja Granny.
Most likely to fall asleep at a party.
Debbie.
Dad wins.
What was that one?
Most likely to fall asleep at a
Wait,
party.
that would be 2 then. That would be you 2. That would be Debbie.
Most likely to take the longest to get ready.
Debbie. Debbie by far.
Most likely to laugh at a serious situation. Most likely to survive a zombie apocalypse.
I know all the.
Oh, absolutely. I know who that is.
Oh,
Are we serious? This is my father. chick with her like life hacks would know how to get through anything.
Oh yes, yes.
Maybe she could build a fort.
I just hide inside a bank.
Most likely to pee their pants. Oh,
easy.
Oh look at us.
She said because he
What does it say? Harry Potter. What does that tell you, her?
I've got none so far.
most likely to cry in public.
Ryan.
Oliver.
Yeah.
Oliver.
If you accidentally bump into him.
Well, you've seen his little mini meltdown earlier.
Yeah.
That's what he tends to do.
Most
Just
likely
scream at the
to.
top of his voice until he gets his own mind.
We're gonna ask these guys.
Most likely to forget something important.
So you forgot a phone.
I'd say it's a mixture of these. Most likely to go to the store and get more than one sample.
Down in here.
He can't decide to buy them both.
What's that? What's that?
Yeah.
Jenny do a little.
Most likely to have the most children. David. Oh, the next one. Most likely to take
What
selfies.
shall we do?
This is a complete
Combination of these two.
Mind
Let's
you,
have a look.
I think Jess might take a few selfies.
Most likely to be more clumsy.
He's got the barbecue all in the sun.
And the most important one, last but not least, the most likely to become president. Me!
Some paradise, tell me who you see, 'cause I think